Alright, so Illustrator. This video is going to be all about Illustrator basics, fundamentals, getting into really just using Illustrator. We're going to touch on a bunch of things. I'll list in the description. This is what we're ultimately going to be making over the course of 2 videos. We're going to make this little motion graphic thing with a little jumpy rocket. We're going to have some particles. We're going to have some work in After Effects and Illustrator. Part 1, this video is going to be on Illustrator, and part 2 will be in After Effects, making all that stuff move around. So I'm going to switch over to Illustrator here. And we're going to create a new one. I'm going to be using an HD TV preset. So 1920 by 1080. You can find that under the film and video presets here at the top. HDTV TV 1080. I'm not going to change any of the settings over here. We're just going to go ahead and click Create. And it's worth noting, I would go ahead and set this up as 4K, but After Effects does not yet support my GPU, so unfortunately I'm kind of just using the GPU inside my laptop. It's not really 4K ready. So it's always good to future-proof if you have the hardware, but if you're just working on a laptop, you're probably not going to be able to. I mean, you can work with 4K. It's just going to be kind of a torturous thing here. So it's worth noting, I'm going to go into my workspaces here. I'm just going to reset my workspace so it looks like your workspace when you start. And let me get back into Essentials Classic here and go ahead and reset this one as well. Adobe is really good lately at hiding all of the stuff that you actually need. And you're probably going to start in this Essentials workspace, which you can find all your workspaces on the window menu. And they've kind of hidden everything except for these properties, layers, and libraries. And I think they really want properties to be like your go-to solution, and it isn't yet. I need all of the stuff like colors and swatches and gradients and transparency, and none of that stuff is available. So I'd recommend that you go up to Window and go to Workspace and go to Essentials Classic instead. And that's what used to be the main workspace. They've still got this properties here, like right in your face, but you can collapse that and then expand out the actual useful panels that we're going to need, which is going to be color, swatches, gradients, transparency. We are not going to need appearance and graphic style, so we can go ahead and get rid of those. So just drag that out, and you can actually do that with any of these. You can just click on a tab and drag the tab out, or you can dock things back in here. You can group them together into different groups or sets of panels. Pretty helpful. I'm going to also open another one that I'm going to need later, which you'll find on the window menu. We're going to go to Pathfinder. And Pathfinder gives us the align, and it also gives us Pathfinder, which is going to let us kind of combine shapes together and do all these different operations to kind of use basic primitive shapes and create something more interesting with them. I'm also going to go up to View. Now, if you're used to working with Illustrator, you're probably used to seeing this white background. In the film and video presets, it gives us a checkerboard pattern, kind of like we get in Photoshop, which is great for being able to see transparency. So like if you had a white object, for instance, being able to see which part of your screen was transparent and which part was actually white would be very difficult with a white background. In this case, though, I find the checkerboard pattern is a little bit much. So I'm going to go into View. And we can always turn this on and off, even if we're in a different preset. But we can turn this on and off by going to View and then doing Hide Transparency Grid, and it'll just bring us back to a white background. Control 0, and I'm not going to go over, or try not to go over all my keyboard shortcuts because they should show up down here at the bottom. All right, so we're going to start this with a rocket. So I'm going to switch to the pen tool, and just, I also want to make sure that my smart guides are turned on. And by default they should be. You probably, if you're just opening Illustrator for the first time, you probably already have smart guides turned on. But if not, those are also on the View menu. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that this first point is aligned right in the center. So I'm going to click here once for a corner. Always click once for a corner, Control Z to undo things. Click and drag to get a curve. And what I'm going for is this cigar shape kind of spaceship. Hold spacebar before you release the mouse button to actually kind of position that point while you're drawing it. That way you don't have to fix it later. So somewhere about there. And then here I'm just going to click once again for another corner, and then here with it showing the purple lines both horizontally and vertically, so it's aligned with the center, the one at the top, and then also the one to the right of it. I'm going to click once again, and finally we're going to come back up here to the top, so it displays that little circle. Click again. And essentially what we're doing is we're drawing half the rocket, we're going to reflect it, and then merge those shapes back together. So now that I've got half of the rocket, I'm going to click it, right click, transform, reflect, and you can preview what it's going to do. If you check this little box, you can preview it and see what it's going to do. 3 options here: cancel OK and copy. OK will just flip it, but if you click copy, it'll make a new version of that shape and flip that. So now I'm going to just click and drag this. I'm holding shift to make sure that it stays in a straight line. I'm just going to drag it over until it snaps, and that little line should turn pink. And then we get our little rocket shape. Now I'm just going to combine these two shapes together. So this is how we get symmetry, is you model one side and then you just combine it with the other side. Kind of similar to the way you might work in 3D. So I'm going to select, just drag a box around these, and then here on Pathfinder we've got this first option is Unite. Now there are all sorts of ways that this can go wrong. You might end up with this long line running down the middle, or you might end up with a bunch of extra points, or it might not even be combined at all. And if that's the case, if you have any extra lines, you're just going to need to Control-Z, undo, and go back and try to make sure it's aligned again. Usually what's happening is that it wasn't perfectly aligned, it wasn't perfectly snapped. You might also end up with a situation too. I'm going to go into direct selection where you end up with a bunch of points, like 2 or 3 up here at the top. And I'm just going to kind of zoom in here and make sure that I don't have extra points. I'm going to click this and then move it over. Yep, I just have the one. Control-0 to zoom out. And we're also going to have this little extra point at the bottom, which we go to the pen tool. And with the pen tool actually does a bunch of different things. So it'll add points to lines. A little plus sign, or if you mouse over a point that already exists, you get this little minus sign, which means we're going to subtract that out. Alright, so Control-0 to zoom back out. And if we want to, we can kind of squish this in a little bit. So I'm holding the Alt key to make sure that it does the same on both sides. If you just do it like this, it's going to squish to one side, which I always find difficult to keep things centered. It's good to keep stuff in the center, work from origin. And that way, you know, if you're trying to add things or make things symmetrical, you can just flip things and everything kind of snaps. It snaps around that center point, which is nice. Next, I'm going to draw the fin. So we're going to click once for a corner. I'm going to hold the Alt key and zoom out a little bit with my mouse wheel. Actually, I'm going to do that a little bit more. I zoomed away in to do this. To be able to see this, it's handy to have this a little bit further up so we can see where the bottom bezier is going. Otherwise it's going to start moving the screen around and that gets a little bit tricky. So holding space, move this over a little bit. Now with the pen tool, another thing that we can do is we can, you know, I don't want this big goofy curve like this, so I can go back up to that point that I just created, click it once, and that will make it like a half corner. So now it's busy on one side and corner on the other. I can go over here, drag this one out, and I'm going to do the same thing again. Click on it, and that will make that one a half corner. So now we've got these two nice arcs. I'm just going to, while I have the pen tool active, I'm going to hold Control. I'm just going to temporarily switch to this direct selection arrow and just kind of spread this out a little bit. So now I can click on this one, just move it up slightly, click this one, and then I can grab this handle and move it over slightly. Okay. And that rocket is looking huge, so I'm going to select the entire thing and just kind of scale it down. So I'm holding Shift to keep it proportional. With the direct selection tool enabled, if you don't hold Shift, it's going to kind of squish things. And if you want to keep the same proportions, obviously you don't want to squish stuff. So I just kind of make it a habit to always hold down Shift whenever I'm scaling things. They did in Photoshop. They did finally make that the default behavior to scale things proportionally, but they have not yet done that in Illustrator. All right, so we've got one fin on one side. Now, how do I make the other fin on the other side? Well, easy. We just right-click, transform, reflect it, and then copy. And now we've got a new copy. The trick here is that we don't have a good way to make sure it's in the same position to keep things the same on both sides. I can eyeball it, but that's not, you know, really symmetrical. It's always going to be a little bit odd on one side, and I want to make sure that this is perfectly symmetrical. So we can use align commands here for this. So if I select both of these and we go to the align panel, we have this little center option. And by the way, if you don't see this align to, which we do need to make sure it's set to artboard, I think by default it's going to be set to selection, so you want to drop that down. Set to align to artboard. If you don't see it, Adobe's other not so handy feature is that it's got multiple states for these menus. One is like that, which is fully expanded, but by default they might show you like this, whereas it's not fully expanded. So if you're seeing that, you just got to click these little arrows. That will expand out this panel, and you can see all the tools that you actually need. All right, so in the align panel, you've got all these, to align things to the left, to the right, to the top, to the bottom, center horizontal, center vertical, and we also have distribute objects, which is pretty handy. And if I click on align center horizontal, which is what I want, it doesn't do what I was expecting. Essentially what it's looking at is it's looking at the center of each of these objects' bounding boxes, which you can kind of gauge by where the middle handle is here, and it's aligning that at the center of the object. So even though we saw this bounding box, this is a bounding box for multiple things selected, it's looking at the bounding box for this individual object and this individual object. What we need to do is treat these as one object, and if we expand out the layers here, we can see kind of what's going on. This is our fuselage, and then we've got these two separate fins. What I want to do, and by the way, when you're working in the layer panel, make sure that you click these little circles to select things. Clicking the layer itself does not select it over here in the workspace. Click the little circle to activate it in the workspace. So I'm going to hold shift and click the little circles for both of these. I'm going to hit Control G and group them. And so now this is going to treat these as one object. They're still separate. I can still expand the group out and move them around individually. But now I can select the group and align center, and that will put both of these exactly in the middle. And I can select all this stuff, align center, just make sure everything stays right in the center. Now I also want to move these underneath the fuselage. Right now it's pretty easy. We can just go into the layer panel. I can drag this down. See, it's got this little line, and what you're looking for is to have a little line show up under the layer you want to put it on. This can start to get to be a little bit much when you have like a ton of objects here in the layer panel. So what I recommend is a keyboard shortcut, Control right bracket or Control left bracket. And that will send this forward and backward on the layer stack. And if you hold Control and Shift and then do left bracket or right bracket, it'll send it all the way to the back or all the way to the front. So left bracket for back, right bracket for front. So I'm going to hold Control Shift and left bracket, send it all the way to the back. All right, so we've got fuselage, we've got fins. Let's give it a window. So I'm going to go over here to my primitive shapes. We've got rectangles, ellipses. And for this, I'm going to use the ellipse. Obviously, I want a round window. The way that these drag out, you start in the center and it drags out like this, which I've always thought is kind of goofy, dragging out from the left corner. It just kind of places things in an arbitrary, very difficult to predict manner. But if you hold the Alt key, Option on a Mac, it'll scale it from the center, which is much easier and much more predictable in terms of placement. You put your mouse where you want it and then scale out, which I've always thought that this should be the default behavior, but what do I know? I just use the software. So we're going to hold Shift as well, and Shift is going to make sure it stays a perfect circle. So we can hold Shift and just scale this however we want it. But now we know it's in the center. I can use that horizontal line center, make sure it's in the center, but we don't really need to because we know exactly where it is. There's our window on this rocket. We're going to add some stripes to this a little bit later, but not quite yet. One other thing that I do want to do before we move on is that I want to kind of round some of these corners out a little bit. So on these fins, for instance, these are a little bit pointy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that one, and I'm going to hold Shift and select that point. I'm using the direct selection tool here, so I can select the points themselves. And just use these little corner widgets. Basically what the corner widgets do is they allow you to round corners out like this. So now it's not quite so sharp. It gives us a little bit more organic look. Same thing on these corners here. I'm going to hold Shift and select both of those, round that out, and let's jump out here, and I'm going to take this one and just round this nose cone out a little bit too. Not a lot, just enough to kind of make it a little bit more pleasing to the eye. All right, so now we've got our rocket. We're going to need a background, so the background is just going to be a big circle. Same thing, I'm going to go from the center here and hold Alt and Shift and just drag out a big circle that will be the background. And we'll size all this stuff later in relationship to each other, but for now we just want the background circle to be there. I'm going to hold Control Shift left bracket to send that to the back. Next, I'm also going to create what's going to be the border. The same way, but this time I'm going to use the star tool. So we have polygon and star work in kind of the same way. You can add faces or subtract faces during the initial creation phase. So as long as you haven't let the mouse button up yet, you can kind of control how many points this has and how long those points are as well. Use the arrow key, down arrow and up arrow. We'll either subtract or add points. So we're going to start with 3, and I'm going to do 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Hold Shift to make sure it stays upright, although that's, doesn't let you change anything else. First, I want to change how long these points are. So these points are a little bit long. I'm going to just make this larger and then hold Control, and now we can change the length of the points. And I want it a little bit something like that. So I'm going to release Control and then something about like that. Oops, I didn't hold Shift though, so now we got to redo it again. Fortunately though, it stores your settings from last time. So last time you use it, it keeps those settings handy, which is nice. So about like that. Another thing I want to do is I want to round these out. Now it's already got all of these points selected, and if I haven't touched anything else, I can just go to the direct selection tool, and it will then show these little corner widgets. Now if you don't see those, or if you've selected something else, I can show you how this works. So I'm just going to go to my main selection tool and then switch to, or click on it and then switch to direct selection. And now you can see it's got all of these points selected. And I can just drag this little guy out and kind of round these out. All right, so now we've got these nice round points on us. Same thing. I want to send this to the back, so I'm going to do Control Shift left bracket. There's something I also want to do with this background, and let's go ahead and hide the rocket stuff for now. Is I want to punch a hole in it. Right now, if I turn off the ellipse, I hide that. This thing is one big solid piece. Ultimately, I want this to actually be on top of the ellipse, and I want it to cast a shadow in After Effects. But I can't do that right now because it's one solid piece. We can't see the background behind it. So in order to fix that, we're going to need to punch a hole in it. We can use this ellipse that we've created before to do that. The problem is, though, if I do it right now, I select both of these, go to Pathfinder and minus front, it's going to delete the ellipse itself. It doesn't look like it's done anything, but if we bring back the rocket fuselage and let's move this guy up above and move it around, you can see kind of what's happened is it's punched a hole in the center, and it's also hidden or deleted that original circle. So I don't want to do that. I want to create a duplicate of the ellipse before I do that. So I'm going to take the ellipse, I'm going to hit Control C, Control V, and it should paste it at the top. Now if it pastes it off in some weird place, you can go to Edit and you can do Paste in Front, which is Control F, or Paste in Back, and that will paste it directly on top of where you want it. Because sometimes when you hit Control V, it'll paste it like down there for some stupid reason, which that's not helpful. So now with both of these ellipses available, I can select one and select this star panel, or this star shape, and I can go up to Pathfinder and then do minus front. Again, with this selected, you want to make sure that the circle is in front. Obviously, if you're doing minus front, it's going to subtract out whatever's in front. Now I can drag this above, and we're not really seeing the changes that creates just because I'm just doing like black and white. This is where our transparency grid will come in handy. If I go to Window and show the transparency grid, we can see a little bit better what's going on with our shapes. All right, so let's go ahead and create the lines. We're going to have some wavy lines going across this that are going to kind of loop down. I'm just going to move off to the side to create these. So to create wavy lines, I start with a polygon. Let's drag this out. So this is why I don't like the transparency grid. It's very hard to see what you're actually drawing. So we're going to go ahead and turn transparency grid back off. Okay. So we've got this polygon, and I want to make this a triangle. So I'm going to use the down arrow to subtract points and hold shift to make sure it's going upright. Important step there, make sure it's going upright. Now I've got one triangle. Now I'm just going to make it a bunch of copies of this, and I could, do Control C, Control V, and paste them out. But a much faster way to make duplicates is to drag while holding the Alt key or Option key on a Mac. So holding Action Shift and Option. Start dragging first. Hold Alt, and then you can hold Shift. If you hold Shift first, that's not going to do what you want. I'm just going to bring this over until that center point snaps to the bottom right corner of the triangle. So we've got one, and now if I want to make more and do that same exact transform, I can hold Control and just hit D for each additional copy that I want to make. And I want to have, I don't know how many I want to have. I want to have an even number, I guess. Let's go ahead and make 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So now we've got 10 of these guys. I'm going to select all of them. We're going to unite these into one big shape, just like that. And then I'm going to go on my direct selection tool with A on the keyboard. Select all these points at the bottom. So notice these are filled in, these are not. Hit delete on the keyboard, and that is going to give me this one straight line of points. And let's go ahead and turn our transparency grid on. I haven't remembered the Shift Control D is the hotkey for that. So Shift Control D. That'll turn that on and off for us. All right. Now I can see how this is working. And notice it's I got this white fill here. Ultimately, I'm going to want to get rid of that, but right now it's kind of helping me see what this is going to look like. I want all these points selected, and I'm just going to round these out using our little handy corner widgets. So I'm going to go ahead and round these out kind of extremely. We can go ahead and remove this white fill by clicking on the object and make sure that fill is active. So in Photoshop, you got a foreground and a background color. In Illustrator, you have a foreground and a stroke color, and we want a fill and a stroke. I want to make sure that the fill is active, and then I can click this little button right here, the None button, and it'll get rid of that for me. Let's go ahead and hide that transparency grid again. All right, so let's bring this guy over here. Ultimately, it just needs to be wider than the circle. We're going to be using the circle to mask it, and it looks like it is. So that's what we want there. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go ahead and scale this down a little bit as well. So I'm holding Alt and just kind of squishing this. I should have squished it before I did the rounding corner widget. Let's go ahead and step back here. So this is an instance where I've kind of gone a little bit too far. So before I rounded those corners out, I want to go ahead and squish this together. If we do it after we round it out, then we end up with those kind of weird things hanging off the edge, which weren't really an issue, but it also creates some problems in the center where the rounding doesn't really work anymore, and you get these kind of weird janky edges in the middle. To make sure that we squish it and kind of make it the proportions we want first, I'm going to go to the direct selection tool now with all these selected and then round these out. We get a much nicer, smoother wavy pattern. We can select this thing again and we'll just click Align Center, Control 0. I'm just going to zoom out to our bigger artboard. And let's go ahead and take that fill off again. Ultimately, what I want this to do is I'm going to have this, a bunch of these just kind of looping, moving down. Now to create a loop, you want the beginning and the ending state to look the same, but you want it to do some movement in between. So to make that, I'm just going to drag this up here so it's just touching the top. This gives us kind of a nice baseline for how to move this around. Next, I'm going to make another duplicate copy of this. So again, holding an Alt key, Shift, and just drag this down until it's completely off the circle at the bottom. And those two are just touching, which is perfect. Now we've got these two lines here. And I'm going to hold Shift and select each one of these. So how do we make all the duplicates in between? Well, I could do the Alt, drag thing, but that doesn't let me control the spacing very much without actually, if I wanted to make it narrower, I would end up having to squish the shape itself, which I don't want to do that. I want to be able to control the spacing while keeping these in the proportions that they're currently at. So I'm going to go to Object. With both of those selected, we're going to go to Blend, And we're going to go to make. And what blend does is it will kind of create a bunch of intermediate steps between two shapes. Now these two shapes are the same, but if you had different shapes, like a circle and a triangle, for instance, it would make a bunch of intermediate steps. This also factors in color as well, so it'll make kind of a gradation of color from one object to the next. And this is close, but it's still not letting us control the spacing between these. So I'm going to go to Object again. That's still selected, and go to Blend again, but this time I'm going to go to Blend Options. Make sure to check this preview box so we can actually see what it's doing. Right now it's doing this smooth color. The software is basically deciding what it thinks is the appropriate number of times to duplicate this. I want to control that though, so I'm going to go to Specify Distance. We've got steps and distance. And in this case I want to control the distance. By default it's 4 pixels. I think for this, if we did like 50, that's a little bit much. Let's try 25. That's a little bit not quite enough, so let's try something in the middle. Let's try like 40. And that seems a little bit much too, so let's go ahead and do 35. Just jumping around, kind of zeroing in on the distance. 35 looks appropriate, so I'm going to click OK. And what that does now is it basically, the software is controlling all the duplicates in between these two shapes, and I can kind of space this out, and it will just fill in the space in between with more duplicates, which is exactly what I want to do here. I need one more. This thing is going to be moving down, and like I said before, to loop, both the beginning and the end need to look the same, and everything else in the middle needs to look like it's moving. Now, if I move this down right now, eventually we're going to see that we kind of run out of lines at the top. What I'm going to do is basically double-click on this, so we can enter isolation mode. So this works for groups and clipping masks and anything else, and including blends. If you enter isolation mode, now we can control these individual objects again. I can change the color, and I can change the shape, and I can do whatever else I want. So I can do something like that, and all the blends will follow. In this case, I'm just going to move this up, and I want to move it up by a specific distance. So we can do that with the transform panel. I could try to eyeball it, but that's not what we're looking for. That's not the precision that we're looking for here. So I'm going to go to transform, and we're going to talk about origins for a second, which is not as crucial in Illustrator as it is in After Effects. But origins and understanding where the origin is and how to move things in reference to the origin is very, very important in After Effects. In Illustrator, it lets us choose our origin. So we have an X and a Y system. W and H are for width and height, which is the kind of size of our object, but X and Y are the position of our object. And so everything is in relationship to some sort of origin. In this case, it lets us choose, and by default it's usually at the center. We're going to go by the way After Effects is set up, which is the top left, and we're just going to kind of keep that in mind. So After Effects origin is always at the top left, not the center, and it's really important when you're moving things around in After Effects to understand that, especially as you get into scripting and you need to type in the numbers yourself. So we've got X and Y. This basically means it's 491.527 pixels to the right, and this is from the center of our object. It's the center of our object is about 490 pixels to the right of the left side of the document. Y is going vertical, so Y is 157 pixels from the top of the document. It's a little counterintuitive, but the higher this number gets, the further away from the top it is, which means the higher this number this gets, the further down it goes. It's a little bit weird, increase the number, move things down, but that's how it works because it's in reference of this kind of top left origin point. I want to move this down by exactly, I think it was 35 pixels, or move this up rather by 35 pixels. So in order to accomplish that, I could go in and try to do the math myself, but Illustrator actually lets us do math right in these little boxes, which is super handy. So I'm just going to type in minus 35. Press enter, and it will actually move it up 35 pixels for us. Again, counterintuitive, I'm subtracting 35 and it's moving up, but again, it's in relationship to the point, which is up in the top left corner. So if I subtract 35, that means it's getting 35 pixels closer to the top. So now we've got this extra line here, and it's automatically filled in. Another line right here where the original one was. If I do Control Z and Control Alt Z, I'm sorry, Control Shift Z, Control Z, Control Shift Z, it'll step forward and backward. You can see what it's doing. The software is basically just filling in this extra line for us. So now I'm going to double click to get out of isolation mode here. And if I select this and move it down until that top line snaps there, then we can see that it's moved, but it doesn't look like it's moved. And that's the key point for looping to work. All right, so we've got our lines, we've got our ship, we've got our background. Now it's time to start adding some color to this. And let's go ahead and position the lines where they should be. They should be under the ship and over the background. So Control left bracket to move back, and it should also be under the outline. So we've got the outline here, which is on top of the lines, which is on top of the background. And don't worry about the fact the lines are kind of spilling out. We're actually going to clip those to the background in After Effects. If we clip them now, that's going to mess up our ability to loop them. So we wanted to clip them in After Effects later. All right, so let's go ahead and give this some color here. And I'll start with the rocket fuselage. Hit V, select this fuselage. I'm going to put gradients on all of this stuff. So to start with a gradient, click the little gradient tool here. Let's make sure that our fill is active, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the stroke for this, but let's make sure the fill is active. And click on gradient. Now we can control our gradient by going to the gradient panel, and we can also use this gradient tool over here, which is pretty handy. So our gradient tool will let us change the direction of it, and I think going left to right is fine. I do want to reverse these colors, although I'm going to be changing these colors anyway, so it doesn't really matter. We want to start actually with a base color, and I kind of need to do that before I can get into editing the gradient. So I want to define a base color and create a color scheme using our color guide. If we go up to the color here at the top, we can select colors in here. I always found this interface to suck, basically, because you can't really get that much control over your colors. So in order to get a little bit more control, we've got this little panel menu. Right now it's an RGB, and we can do HSB, CMYK. It is in the RGB setting that we want. The problem is, like other things with these little arrows in the align panel, Adobe has kind of hidden the tools that we actually need. So if I click this little button, it'll expand it out so we actually get RGB mixers. If you're used to mixing with paint, this is going to be a little bit of a leap. Different primaries, red, green, and blue are primaries instead of red, yellow, blue. So if we mix red and green together, it makes yellow. If we mix red and blue together instead of purple, it's going to make magenta. And if we mix green and blue together, it's going to make cyan. And if we mix all the colors together, instead of making black, it's going to make white. So it's reverse. This is an additive system. Paint is what's called a subtractive system. And what we want to do is just mix something up. I'm thinking that I'll make this some kind of orange, which means we're going to need less blue and probably less green as well. I think that's probably a little bit too much orange, though, so we can kind of tweak this until we're happy with it. And the nice thing about the color sliders here is that it will kind of show us in the bar like what color we're going to get if we kind of continue mixing these. I'm going to add just a little bit of blue back in to kind of push this more into the magenta area. It's kind of an orangey magenta color. Let's push this just a little bit more and add just a tad more red. I'm always really indecisive with colors, so you're going to have to watch me poke at sliders for a little bit. Actually, I think that's probably fine. So this kind of like salmon, let's make it just a bit more orangey. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go to color guide here, which if you don't have color guide, you'll find that on the window menu. The color guide lets us essentially establish a bunch of colors here, all based on a certain color scheme. If you've worked with color harmonies before, then you'll recognize things like complementary and split complementary. And essentially what we've got, if we click this little drop-down arrow, there's a bunch of different color harmonies. We've got everything from complementary and split complementary all the way down to like these weird things like pentagram, for instance. And I think for this particular one, I'm going to need kind of a mix of warm and cool colors. And actually, let's see here. This tetrad is actually looking kind of promising. I want some blue-greens, but I also like the option of that purple in there. So let's go ahead and we'll stick with this tetrad here. So the tetrad active, we get all these like purples and red, oranges, and also this like kind of minty green color, which is a good mix of warm and cool colors. right now I'm showing warm and cool colors. If you go to the panel menu, you can also show tints and shades or vivid muted. Now I can very easily go into color and just click this drop down, go to HSB, and then change the intensity, you know, if it's vivid, if it's muted, if it's bright, if it's dark. So I don't see a whole lot of value in displaying those. Instead, I'd rather see this warm and cool because it really gives me a nice big selection of colors to work with. If we want to keep all these colors in swatch menu, you can click this button, but it only adds just those 5, which isn't exactly what we want. So instead, I'm going to deselect everything so we don't change our colors. Once we start clicking on these, it's going to apply that color to whatever we have selected. I'm going to go into my swatch menu. Go ahead and create a folder with nothing selected. Make sure to click off of your swatches, but go to once you've done that, click on the folder, click OK. It'll make a new folder. And I'm just going to click up here on this top one, hold Shift, click on the bottom one, and drag those down in here. And you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but you get this little blue line that shows up. That means that we're going to stick those into that folder. So now we've got this nice selection of colors here ready to go. So now I can apply these to all the different things in here. And what's even handier is I can drag these swatches down to create gradients. So with this selected, I can click on gradient again and then drag that same kind of salmon color down here. And I think maybe like this purple color is probably good. And then I can get rid of these other knots by just dragging them off of the line. So now we've got this nice like warm orangey red color to purple. That's looking pretty good to me. I think I'll go ahead and leave it there. With the fins, oh, and actually as I go, I'm going to go ahead and save these gradients just in case I want to reuse them. So if you want to add a gradient to your swatches panel, you can just click and drag that gradient up. And I'm just going to stick it into the folder with these others. Oh, it didn't let me add it to a folder. Forget. We can't actually put these in a folder, so I'm just going to drag it up there and stick it in with the rest of the swatches. So now I'm going to do the same thing with the fins, but I'm going to use a different gradient. So we'll click black and white gradient again, and I'm just going to drag this kind of greenish color and then maybe like a blue, and then get rid of these other knots. And because I set up this color scheme, I don't need to spend a lot of time like poking color sliders and that kind of thing. That gets a little bit tedious. So we can just kind of try different things out with different swatches. It's looking pretty good. The direction though is a little bit weird. It's going to the right, and it's going to the right independently in both objects. I'm going to use my gradient tool here. You can just drag this straight down. So we're not actually seeing the gradient tool. There seems to be a bug in this newest version of Illustrator where we don't actually see the gradient tool sometimes. So if you don't see it, just kind of drag it directly down. All right, that's looking good. Let's go ahead and get rid of the stroke on that. So I'm getting rid of the stroke on these as I add fills to them. Let's go ahead and add a gradient to this window. So same thing, click on black and white gradient. And for this one, I'm just going to add kind of a blue and purple color. And I'm trying to imagine like a light source is going to be on the right side of this eventually. It doesn't need to be super accurate, but I do want to kind of be consistent with where I'm putting my colors and shadows and stuff like that. So darker colors, in this case on the right, because like I'm thinking like inside the rocket ship would be shaded on that side, and then light would like come in the window there. Whereas on the outside, we've got the brighter color on the right side. And this one, I'm not going to get rid of the stroke. I'm just going to add a color to the stroke, like a flat color. We can use this little button here to kind of bump that up. Maybe actually, let's make it like something reminiscent of what's on the fins down here. So we've got that little linkage going on. So we've got this little green thing going on here. Actually, before I get too far with this, I do want to give this kind of a highlight. I want to give this a little feeling of texture. Obviously, this is supposed to be a metal fuselage and a glass window, and in order to make it look a little bit more like glass, we want to put a specular highlight on there to kind of show the smoothness. To do that, I guess there are a bunch of different ways that you can do that, but I'm just going to draw it with a pen tool. So click once up here, and then over here kind of near the side, I'm just going to hold Shift and drag this up and down so it stays nice and proportional. And try to follow that circle as close as possible. Doesn't need to be perfect. And then over here, I'm just going to click once. That's pretty good. Now I'm going to come over here, and hopefully kind of put it next to, it's not exactly next to that one, and then up here, click that. Now I'm going to take the stroke off, obviously, and then I can just go to my direct selection tool and use the arrow key to kind of bump this up. Or I guess if that's not working, we can hold shift and just kind of drag it up and down. This trouble is it's not really showing us these other, like if it's snapping to this one, I guess we can do that and then just drag it over like that. Oh, but now we've got this kind of going on. So when you're trying to snap stuff and it doesn't snap to what you want it to snap to, it can be kind of aggravating. Let's just move this guy over a little bit more. I'm going to take these two here on the ends and just round these out with our little corner widget guy so they look a little bit smoother. That's looking pretty close. Now what I want to do with this, I'm not going to change the gradient, but I am going to go into select the main thing. I'm going to go into transparency. And just like in Photoshop, we have blend modes, except they're not on the layer panel, they're on the transparency panel. So right now it's on normal. I'm going to set this to screen, and now it's going to make everything else underneath a little bit brighter. It's a little bit too bright, so I'm just going to change the opacity, make it a little bit darker. A little bit less effective. Now I'm going to hit Control 0 and zoom out. So now we've got this nice little kind of shiny, round, reflection-looking thing. Let's take that and just use our arrow key and bump it in a little bit more. Okay. Same thing with the rocket fuselage. I'm going to start way up here at the top and then kind of follow this shape. It doesn't need to follow it exactly, and it's a little bit better even if it's not perfectly symmetrical on the highlights. And then I'm just going to come down to there. Looks pretty good. And I always like to draw these first, and then, you know, after you've drawn it, you can kind of see what it's going to look like. Then you can kind of tweak the shapes. But I find it's better to draw it first and get an idea what it's going to look like before trying to perfect it and tweak it. And now I have the option to kind of go in and make one handle longer than the other if I need to. So I've got this nice highlight. Same thing, I'm going to give this the exact same color as the rocket fuselage. In order to do that, we can use this eyedropper tool. So click eyedropper, click the fuselage, it'll make it exactly the same gradient. It'll also make it the same stroke as well, so keep that in mind. If you are eyedropping stuff, it takes not just the fill, but also the stroke. Alright, so it's the same color. Just like before, I'm going to go into screen. We're going to set the opacity down a little bit so it's not quite so strong. And then I'm also going to round this top and bottom out just a little bit. Now it's not showing me the corner widget on the bottom one. Let's zoom out so we can see the top one at least. And it should round out both of these. Nope, it's not. All right. Why is this not rounding out? Maybe it's a little bit too... Yes, it's a little bit too far down there. So what we'll do is we'll just go to my pen tool and add a couple of points here. We'll kind of round this out manually. Click the minus sign there. And then we'll just come in here and grab this little guy. Now notice it's making my lines all weird, so this is why we need to tweak this again now. So we're going to come back out. Oh, it's actually not that bad. It's just a little bit weird. Not too bad. Oops. So now we're starting to get more objects here, and so it's going to be harder to select the thing that we want. Now, this one now I can go ahead and use a little corner widget to round that out. I don't have to manually do it. All right, so we've got our highlights. We've got a rocket, fuselage. Oh, we also need to add the engine at the bottom. So for that, I'm just going to take the... This is really cheap, I know. I'm just going to take the window and hold Alt and duplicate and just drag this down, squish it a little bit. And then for this, I'm going to go into the pen tool, and I'm just going to subtract that pen tool, that little point out. Let's get rid of the stroke. Actually, let's go back in here and take this point. This is getting, again, hard to see what I'm doing. So let's go into direct selection here. So we've got this one. I'm going to direct select one of those, and then I'm just going to hold shift in the middle of this and kind of drag this line up, and see it'll change both the anchor points, or both the Bezier handles at the same time for us, which is handy. All right, let's give this, drag it a little bit further down so we got this nice kind of like bell-shaped engine. Let's give it a slightly different gradient though. So this one, I'm going to click the new gradient. Oh, I've got my stroke still selected, so let's click new gradient with the fill selected. And I don't know, I think for this, we'll start with more of like a gray color. So I just clicked it instead of dragging it to the gradient panel. We'll start with this kind of like, I don't know, brownish grayish color, and then we'll go to like really warm orange, so it looks like it's glowing at the end maybe. I don't know, we'll see. Something like that, and then I'm just gonna rotate this by 90 degrees. And I'm not gonna get super into details with this because it's gonna be moving around a lot. You do need to kind of manage your time with this. Don't get super sucked into details. I'm just going to take this, hit Control, left bracket a couple of times, and stick it behind the rocket fuselage. All right, perfect. So in order to get these kind of and hide them all at once, I'm going to take all of this stuff, the fins, fuselage, the highlight, the window, and the window highlight, and I'm just holding Shift and selecting all those things. I'm going to hit Control G. In the layers panel, that will group them all together. Now I can just hide them and kind of get them out of the way for now so I don't mess them up adding colors to the rest of this. With this one, since it's going to rotate, I don't want a gradient on it because we're going to see the gradient rotating around. I just want it to be the same on all sides. We could add a gradient in After Effects if we wanted, but for now I'm just going to leave this. Actually, let's bring this back so we can actually see what it's going to look like. With this, let's go ahead and take the stroke off. But on the fill, give it like a purple color or something, kind of like that purple. And while we're doing this, let's go ahead and do the background as well so we can see what these two colors are going to look like next to each other. It's a little bit too bright, so let's do a darker blue like that. Looks a little bit more like space. Perfect. All right, now we can tweak this and just kind of say, you know, do I want it to be a little bit warmer? That's a little bit too intense. It's coming forward too much. Compared to the rocket, you could do like a green, but I think having a little contrast here will be better, so we'll just stick with that purple that we had before. For these lines, I want to change the color, but the color on these is on the stroke, so I need to switch to the stroke. And we can do like a little green line. I'm thinking probably just a light bluish green will probably be fine. Let's, we can also change the stroke on these. But for that, I'm going to need to go into the stroke panel because it's disappeared. Since this control bar is contextual, it doesn't see the blend itself as having a stroke, so it just kind of like gives us controls for placement of the blend, overall blend itself. But if we go into stroke, we can see stroke controls and just thicken these up just a little bit. All right, and then finally, I do want to also add a stripe to this. I want to give this rocket like a little kind of racing stripe, or a little horizontal, kind of diagonal stripes across. So I'm going to use the line tool for this. I see a lot of people will try to add stripes and they'll like try to like start with a square and then make it perfectly fit to the sides of these. Unnecessary. We're going to use clipping masks in order to do this. I'm just going to start with the line. Doesn't matter how long it is. Doesn't need to be proportional. And then kind of make it about like that. We'll give this guy a color. I think this, probably just like the others, will make it one of these colors kind of similar to the fins. Something like that. We'll make the stroke a little bit thicker. And then I'm going to go to my main selection tool and I'm just going to drag this down. One, Control D to make another one. Actually, I think what I'm going to do with these two on the outside here, with those selected, I'm going to make the stroke a little bit thinner on those. Something like that. Nice. Okay. Now for a clipping mask to work, these all need to be one object. A clipping mask can only clip one thing at a time. If I try to do it with these all separate, it would only clip one of them. So I need to put these into a group so it treats them as one object, and then I'll clip the group instead of trying to clip each object individually. Now, another thing about clipping masks is that they use other shapes in your layout here, and I want to use the rocket fuselage to do this. However, Let's go ahead and put this in the group with the rest of the stuff. If I do use the rocket fuselage, it's basically going to destroy it. So if I took these and put the stripes right under the rocket fuselage, I'll shift and select the rocket fuselage, and I'm just going to hit the Control 7 key to do this. It's going to hide the fuselage. By necessity, a clipping mask can't have any properties of its own, and it has to be on top of the lines anyway in order to clip them. So that's not going to work. So what I need to do is I need to duplicate this. I'm just going to hit Control C, Control B to paste in back. I said I did that, but it didn't actually do it. It doesn't seem. Let's see if it actually did. No, yeah, it didn't actually do anything. So let's select these again. Control C to copy, and then let's do Control F. It'll paste on the front, and then let's just use the original. Select both of these, again using the little circles here, and then hit Control 7. Now I don't see it, but that's just because the lines are underneath that original. So I can drag these up in the layer order, and now we see the lines. They are underneath our highlight. So the highlight is going over the lines as it should. We've got this little decoration on our ship. That's pretty much it for the setup, or actually creating the art. Now we just need to prepare it for animation. So when you bring things into After Effects only understands layers. It doesn't understand that objects on the layers are also separate. So even though we've got a bunch of objects here, when we bring this into After Effects, all it's going to see is layer 1, and it's going to treat this as one like solid image, which isn't what we want. Obviously we want the rocket to move around, we want this little border thing to rotate, we want these lines to move down and loop, and we want to use the background as a clipping mask. So we want all these separate, and they're separate right now, but we need to separate them out to new layers. And I could do this by creating new layers and dragging them each to a new layer, but if you have a lot of art, that gets kind of tedious. There's a shortcut to do that. Remember when I said that clicking these little circles activates things in the artboard area, but does not change anything. But if you select like these here and highlight them blue, it doesn't actually activate them over here. What it does is it activates them within the layer panel. So if I go click on this layer at the top, now it is selected within the context of the layer panel, and I can go perform operations on it with this little layer menu. So click the layer menu, and we're going to go up to release layer sequence. And still, they're all on the same layer, but now they're all on layer 1, but now they're each in their own separate layers. So you can actually have layers within layers. So what I want to do now is just select all of these guys and drag them out of layer 1, which means I need to drag them up. And pay attention to what these lines are telling you here. If this line is going to drag them under layer 1. If I drag them here so layer 1 is highlighted, it's going to drag them into layer 1. If I drag them above layer 1, you get this little line. I'm going to go ahead and release, and that's basically just going to put them on top of layer 1. Now I can just delete layer 1. Now another thing in After Effects that you're going to find is super frustrating, especially once you start scripting things, is knowing what's on each layer. If all these say is layer 2, 3, 4, that's not very descriptive of what the object actually is. So we're going to need to change the names of these. So this is going to be rocket. As you're doing this, be consistent with your capitalization. If you're going to capitalize the first letter every time, always do that because it will make a difference in your scripting. Okay, this is going to be border this here, and I'm just double clicking on these to get the name thing to open. That's the stripes. And then this here is the background. I'm just going to type in back. So we got rocket, border, stripes, and back. Keep these kind of short too, because the more text you've got here, the more text you're going to have to write in your script, and the more options or opportunity for stuff to go awry. Next, let's just kind of scale these. Now this is set up with the format of an HD TV screen, so we kind of want to scale our stuff proportionally for that, and also think about where this is going to be moving, and we leave enough room for things to move around on the screen. So as it is right now, this background is a little bit big, the rocket is a little bit small, so I'm just going to scale everything down a little bit. I'm also going to we'll just put all of this stuff in the center. Oops, and I moved my lines, which I didn't want to do. So we'll put all of this stuff except for the lines. It's horizontally centered, and then yeah, we'll just leave those as is. We can move that stuff around as a comp a little bit later. The rocket is actually going to be kind of hanging out, so it's going to be jumping around like this and hanging outside of that stroke. Now I'm holding Alt and Shift to make sure the stays proportional. The rocket is proportionally is looking pretty good, but it's also a little bit too big, so it's kind of hanging off the screen. So we can scale these down. Now these are vector graphics, and even though After Effects is going to treat them as rasters, we can actually have After Effects recalculate things. So if you wanted stuff to scale up, it would get pixelated, but we can, there's a little checkbox in After Effects that we can activate that'll keep it from doing that too much. Now this is still kind of going outside of our video safe area, so let's scale this a little bit more down. This is going to look kind of small, but that's okay. One thing you want to do too is you're doing this. See, I'm scaling this up. Notice that it's keeping the number of these, or the number of these keeps changing, but it's keeping the spacing between them even. Let's go back a couple of steps here. I want these stripes to kind of stay in the position that they're supposed to be in. And I want them to stay in the position that they're supposed to be in relative to the background. And I want to keep the same number. We've kind of established the look that we want for this. Let's go ahead and hide this border for just a second. So if you wanted to keep from changing the number of stripes, like there we've got fewer of them. One thing that you can do is expand these. So I'm going to select just the stripes. Make sure that only your stripes are selected. And when you're happy with the blend and you want it to stop kind of automatically adding and subtracting lines for you, you can go up to Object, Expand. And what that'll do is it'll just turn these into lines, individual lines for you. You don't want to expand anything else, just that. So make sure you don't expand like your rocket fuselage. That should stay where it is, because if you expand things to the gradients, it gets a little bit weird. Let's go ahead and turn that back on. But yeah, now we can go ahead and scale this stuff down without having our lines decrease in number. So now we keep the same number of lines, and they just get smaller and smaller. The thing you'll probably want to do too is on your, notice that these lines are starting to look really thick in relationship to the rest of this. On the transform thing, there's a scale strokes and effects. Let's go back up to I keep scaling and then keep having to go back out here. So as it's scaling down, the line is getting smaller, but the stroke is not, and so the stroke starts to become very thick in relation to the size of the line itself. So if we want the stroke to also scale, we can go to transform and just tick this box for scale strokes. And in fact, you can also do for corners as well, but I don't have any rounded corners, so we're not worried about that. What that'll do is now as we scale this down, it'll also make the lines a little bit thinner. Okay, so now we can go ahead and select all this stuff, holding Shift and Alt, scale it down. Select a rocket, move it up. Holding Shift and Alt, we'll scale it up a little bit. That actually looks about right. We'll probably have to change this a little bit in After Effects. Let's make it a little bit smaller than that. And if it's going to be smaller, then we can scale everything up a little bit more than it is. Which, yeah, that's probably fine. We might have to scale things in After Effects when we get there, but as is, it probably is going to work out just fine. So what you should have, you want to make sure that everything that's going to animate separately is on its own separate layer. And now that we've done this, I'm just going to go ahead and save this file out. So we're going to go to File, Save As. And I'm just going to use the same Illustrator preset, make it an AI file. This rocket. And yeah, it's adding extra stuff here. Make sure it's set as an AI file. Click Save. If you're working with an older version, or you might be going back to an older version, you might want to save this for a legacy format, but I'm just going to save it as CC. Click OK, and now we've got our file ready to go, ready to be imported into After Effects. So in the next video, we're going to be importing this and moving things around, scripting a little bit, and entirely in After Effects. So I will see you in that next video.